Psalms 5. Lead me in your righteousness. The constant presence of enemies, which is a shadow seldom absent in David's Psalms, is again felt here chiefly through the menace of their propaganda, seen in verses 6 and 9. This is a morning psalm, similar to Psalms 3, made up of 5 divisions, 3 of which are turned full face to God, alternating with 2 that passionately denounce the enemy to him. The whole psalm expresses the spirit of the cry in verse 2, "My King and my God." The Psalms is divided into 5 different divisions. The first is in verse 1 to 3, which is titled the Morning Watch. The word which translates as groaning is better translated as my innermost thoughts or my sighs. It is barely audible self-communing, but there is a growing clarity as it breaks out into a cry for help in verse 2, and then into articulate, disciplined, and expectant prayer in verse 3. In verse 2, the covenant relationship expressed by the repeated "my" is the phrase "my King and my God," gives the prayer a firm footing, and the use of the word king puts David's own kingship into the right context. He accepts that he is a man under authority, not one who must struggle for his own ends by his own means. In verse 3, the word "a sacrifice" are a translator's assumption, though probably a correct one. The Hebrew has the single word "prepare," which can be used for setting out in order anything from a feast to a case at law, and therefore perhaps for one's plea to God or one's self-preparation. But it is often a priestly term for laying the altar fire and arranging the pieces of the burnt offering. The emphasis on the morning rather suggests that this, by possible allusion to the daily sacrifice at God's threshold, where I will meet with you to speak there to you, as in Exodus chapter 29 verse 42. David, it seems, puts his praying into such a context to express the assurance of atonement and the total commitment to which he comes before God. However, he also comes unexpectedly. The word "watch" is used in God's prophets posted to report the first signs to his answer, as in Isaiah chapter 21 verse 6 and 8, and Micah chapter 7 verse 7, and Habakkuk in chapter 2 verse 1. As at the tent of meeting, God would speak there, not only listen. Next is in verses 4 to 6, the champion of right. The prayer now takes shape as a plea for justice. Note the crescendo from the mild negative of verse 4 to the expression of divine wrath in verses 5 and 6. The very integrity of the judge, which would be David's undoing if he were under rigorous moral scrutiny, is his refuge under wrongful attack. This emerged openly in Psalms 143 verse 2, where David, the plaintiff, pauses to acknowledge that if God were to try his character instead of his case, he would be undone. This is taken for granted in the psalmist's protestations of innocence. They know that they are in the right. Vice versa, their opponents, as disputants in, so to speak, a civil court. In its general relation to God and His law, their heart is perfect. They are totally committed. Next is verses 7 and 8, which is titled the Pilgrim Spirit. The significance of the words, "but I will enter thy house," is sharpened by the proximity of verse 4. Evil can be no guest of thine. This is why it must be through thy great love. It may also be that David is in exile, praying that he will bring me back and let me see his habitation. As the expression towards thy holy temple would imply. But such words could also be used of prayer offered at the thresholds itself. With the ark kept in a mere tent in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 2, the words house and temple are surprising on the lips of David. This could indicate that of David in the Psalm's titles is a term used in a special sense, or that the traditional names of God's dwelling lived on from the days of Shiloh. Or possibly that David's language had been adapted to the use of latter worshippers. The second suggestion seems the more cogent. In verse 8, the word chosen for my enemies perhaps emphasizes their vigilance, but the answer to my peril is in the twofold. Thy, with its frank acceptance of a higher standard and a surer aim than one's own. Next is verse 9 and 10, titled The Campaign of Lies. The bloodthirsty and deceitful men of verse 6 are now exposed and prayed against. With such people, all their resources of speech, mouth, throat, and tongue combine to achieve and to conceal the designs of the heart. The methods of those of the serpent in Eden and its minor brood, the flatterer and the scandalmonger. An open sepulchre waiting for its occupants is the grim picture used in Jeremiah chapter 5 verse 16 to express murderous efficiency in battle. Here and in Romans chapter 3 verse 13, where the reader finds himself included in the charge, there is probably a hint of the grave's corruption as well. In verse 10, pronounce them guilty catches the meaning of the opening plea, which is a single word, the opposite of justify. It is the first of three aspects of judgment in this verse: exposure, collapse, and expulsion. For evil is vulnerable to truth, to its own instability, and to the direct divine action. With regards to the second of these, that is the rebels' downfall by their own counsels, sees David's prayer against Ahithophel in 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 31 and its remarkable outcome. Note finally that the motivation of this appeal for judgment is not personal. Ultimately, the rebellion is not against me, but against thee. And finally, in verses 11 to 12, the sure defense. Although danger is not forgotten, the psalmist now breaks free of his loneliness. He is no longer a man carrying on his own, hemmed in by his foes, but is conscious of a whole company who can join him in praise. And by a happy contrast, the last word in the Hebrew, thou dost cover him, is one whose only other occurrence is in 1 Samuel chapter 23 verse 26, where it describes a hostile force closing in on David, only to find itself quietly deflected by God's encircling providential care over David. It is interesting to note that the psalm distinguishes two parties by different criteria. The enemies are described morally, they do wrong, tell lies, and bloodthirsty and deceitful. The righteous, however, are described religiously, that they by their great mercy come into your house, take refuge in you, and love your name. The key feature that separates the righteous from the wicked is not their moral conduct, but their affinity to Yahweh's house. As Christians today, we know where the church lies. It is the living bride of Christ, and it lives in us. And it only lives if we allow it to live through our moral choices and decisions in the manner we live our lives today. Christ has come, Christ has shown, Christ has revealed the path. Faith only is the first step. Sins of the past are forgiven, sins of the present. But the sins of the future calls us to walk in His path and mirror His ways, that we can finally be righteous in the presence of our Lord. Thank you, and God bless.